So next slide. And that will be of the Bible and Ecology, which is by Richard Bowker. And he is saying in the rest of the first chapter that agriculture, growing food, is the way to subdue and fill the land, as commanded in Genesis, but not at the expense of other creatures, to whom God has granted every green plant in Genesis 1:30. And indeed, wild animals are to be left the fields to eat from after the fall in the sabbatical year. Mosaic Jewish law had strict rules governing agriculture and leaving areas fallow. So we can see crop rotation has been around for a long time, as well as care for the rest of creation. Now, he tells of a very violent period after the fall when Adam and Eve were driven from Eden. And things got so bad that God decided to bring an end to his experiment. But he was deterred by one good man, Noah. And Noah's story is one of saving the species of the creation, that our future is inseparable from that of the other creatures. And he had to save one of each pair in his ark. And this again shows how we should be caring for our world, just as Noah was commanded to. So next slide. So Christian and Jewish texts can show that the current plunder of the earth is not part of God's scheme. The rise of science and technology has led to this. Francis Bacon, who was a famous scientist, said that we must torture nature in order to force her to reveal her secrets. Well, we're doing quite a lot of that with intensive farming at the moment. So Bauckham thinks we must be kind and caring to all creation and cites Psalm 145, verses 8 to 9. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. The Lord is good to all, and his compassion is over all that he has made. So having an allotment and using crop rotation, giving extra produce to food banks, and leaving part fallow for wildlife is following these principles and can show how green Christianity can be. So we'll get on to the next slide. This is a photograph I took a few weeks ago of this year's plan for the allotment, following the idea of a mandala, a permaculture idea. So it's not sort of straight lines, which, well, as an artist, it kind of appealed to me to make it look like a work of art. And I also use it as a basis for doing art workshops from too. So that's how I mapped it out, using a little sawdust. And next slide. I thought we'd better do a bit about soil types, because they are the basis of it all. So there's a sort of a plan there of all of the different kinds of soils. And I'm not sure if you can read it, or I'll read it out a bit. I think mine is actually a clay soil because it's very wet and cold in winter and baked dry in summer, but that might just be climate change. Sandy soils are light, dry, warm, low in nutrients and often acidic. Silt soils are fertile, light, moisture retentive, and easily compacted. Loams are a mixture. Peat soils are high in organic matter and moisture. Probably have them around the Lake District. Chalky soils are very alkaline That would be in the southeast, in Surrey and Kent, I should think. Light or heavy. Now, I'm not sure that the type of soil or its pH as to acidic or alkaline matters much if one is spreading a sheet mulch autumn. My soil is now quite an agglomeration from layers of volcanic ash, lime with the brassicas every few years, cardboard, straw, never hay or you'll sprout grass seeds, and then manure. So I plant into this sheet mulch each spring that I've laid down in the autumn and leave to rot. And that keeps carbon in the soil because you're not digging it out. Okay, so next slide. These are some of my charred plants that have survived the winter. And I'm growing more and more of those because it will mean I don't have to plant so much each year. And they're very pretty and they perennial. And also at the back, you can see a couple of the globe artichokes coming up. So I'm planting more and more of those as well. And the dandelions. It's important to leave the dandelions at first for the bees because they have their first drink of the spring from dandelions. Next slide. A lot of people asked about raised beds last month. So I've done a bit of a research on them. And there's a site at the bottom of the slide, the RHS site, which has a lot about raised beds. And they can help with drainage if the soil is waterlogged. So probably Cumbria and Scotland would be good for them, but you will need some more watering in dry areas. A couple of my allotment neighbours have got them, and they say don't put a membrane down at the bottom when you start them because that stops the water coming up, so it makes them more dry. And the soil in raised beds warms up quicker, allowing for earlier planting as it drains more easily. But it's important to fill the beds with good soil and organic material to help root zone conditions, the area underneath. Now, my neighbours, they say that they use mushroom compost as mulch to keep everything nice and moist. Now, they can help if the local soil is mismatched. For example, you could put acid soil in a raised bed for alkaline hating plants, ericaceous ones. And of course, raised beds are helpful for the disabled as they can be accessed around from a wheelchair or not so far to bend down. My local allotment society have a section of special raised beds for disabled gardeners. They're a lot of work to install, so weigh up carefully whether you can solve the drainage and access problems first. I haven't done them as I'm in the dry south, and also slugs and snails tend to live on the boundaries. You can look for recycled and salvaged materials to cut down cost and not waste new supplies and money. I mean, there are a lot of free cycle and recycled schemes going to get materials from if you want them. And they also recommend that you build them in the winter, except if the land gets waterlogged, in which case do them in the summer. And you can either construct them with the keyhole permaculture idea or the more common rectangles. And that's the site to get more information about how to build them and which treated woods to avoid. Ones that might give you nasty chemicals in your soil, I guess. Okay, so the next slide. Now, there's a picture I took recently. That's dismantling an old corrugated iron shed that I've got. I'm going to dismantle it and cut the metal into strips and sink the metal. We'll have to dig a trench around the allotment and sink the metal into the soil in an attempt to keep couch grass at bay, because the couch grass has come back around the edges from all paths, the communal paths. So that's how I'm going to try and stop that, because I want to try and stop digging so that I'm not releasing carbon. So this is my plan, and I'll be able to see if it works. So next slide. So we come to the exciting part of the year, seed planting. So we've got lots of seeds to go out, and for the areas where the slugs and snails like to eat them, I've put the nematodes in. I've just done that on Saturday, and I have to water them. I'm afraid I have to use the hose to water them each day so they don't dry out or they'll die, because the little nematodes are microscopic worms that will eat the slugs for 6 weeks until the veg is strong enough to cope. And I'm going to do a rainwater harvesting scheme because I'm getting so dry here. And I've got some old water butts and going to have to get some salvaged bricks and build them up on a descending tier from my art studio roof. Luckily, my allotment is accessed from the end of my garden, so I can take the water from there down into the allotment. But you also have to go out, as well as using nematodes, you also have to go out as soon as it stops raining, if it ever rains, and weed the beds of molluscs, as my frogs are a bit lazy. And then we collect them, and then we release them in the local woods while walking the dog. I'm planted out the onions, and the sheet mulch was quite hard to make holes in. So before we did the beetroots yesterday, I put the hose on the sheet mulch to make it easier to work into. Okay, so that's seed planting, and the next one is a picture of the greenhouse. Some of those went out over the weekend and got planted, and there's more to go. And as well as planting the actual seedlings, what I tend to do is I plant a seedling and then put a seed next to it, so that I'll have different ones coming up at different parts of the summer. Okay, so next slide. Right, so this is the planning ahead bit. So we have to keep topping up the frog ponds from the rain, but in the hopes they will start working. Keep saying they won't pay their rent, they won't catch, they won't keep eating slugs and snails. They're supposed to. As I've said, I'm planning a rainwater system, and I'll talk more about that next time. But try and find water butts in the meantime, if you can, from Freecycle or wherever, and start collecting all natural materials for the next autumn sheet mulch. And I've started having a hot compost. I've got an old-fashioned old metal dustbin that I'm putting my kitchen waste into, because otherwise you'll get rodents if you put things like eggshells and that into ordinary compost. And another water butt to grow nettles and comfrey for tomato feed. And thinking ahead for the autumn again, collect old tins, jars and labels for future seeds. And the sticks from ice lollies are handy to keep for seed tray labels. And look out on FreeCycle for an old set of wooden shelves to store the vegetables. If you've got a shed, it should be a cool shed or an outhouse where you can start storing veg when it starts arriving, and any freezer space for blanching and freezing some for the winter. And the bibliography from the first workshop is on the Green Christian website. It's on their YouTube channel, and it's got all of the different recommended books and links that I talked about in the first workshop that are also still very handy. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. You can unmute now.
Brilliant. I'm just sorting out some rooms for people to go and discuss things. Are there any questions before we go into groups? Are there any questions that anybody has for Marisa? Anything particular? Actually, I know I should, sorry, carry on. Sorry, yes.
But where do we get nematodes from? I probably didn't study the script on the slide enough, but could Marisa say a little bit more about how to get nematodes and to, you know, tackle the slug problem?
Yes, well, I get mine from the Organic Gardening Catalogue Company, where I get some of my seeds from. That one. Seeing it back to front.
No, we're seeing it the right way round. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah. They've got a website, and I'm a member, and I think I get 10% off. But my neighbour has told me that apparently it's possible to make nematodes. So he's only just told me that. So I'm going to look into that and see if it's possible to make them. But otherwise, you buy them and they send them, and you have to keep them in the fridge, and you have to measure them out with lots of different containers of water and spread them on the areas like brassicas where the slugs and snails will eat them, and keep them watered for a week, and then you can plant out the brassicas. And I have used them for some years, and they do seem to help.
So they're not like those little red worms that you have for the vertical composting system, you know, with the trays that you can have in your kitchen if you want to risk having worms in your kitchen.
No, they're not a wormery. I did get wormery on FreeCycle, but I haven't got it going yet. But that's a future plan. No, these are microscopic.
Oh, right.
They're really, really thin.
Yeah.
But they multiply over the period of the week while you water them. And then you plant into them at the end of the week and keep them watered for yet another week. But you'd have to anyway to water the seedlings.
There's much learning to do.
I have a different experience with the raised beds, Marisa, from yours, or from what your friend said. In that, when the garden is very dry, which it has been the last couple of summers, I've been able to keep the beds well watered without wasting water, and the soil has remained nice and moist, you know, under the first inch or so. So it's been a bit, so you can, it swings and roundabouts really. You can do it one way or the other. So also we did line it. We did put a membrane in, to stop pernicious weeds getting in, and it doesn't appear to have affected the moisture too much, I don't think. But then maybe it's because I'm keeping an eye on it.
Good, good.
Yeah. Any more questions before we break into groups? Okay, I'm sure there'll be some more when we come back in about probably 25 minutes.